I don't know how this happened, but I accidentally went 9 months without recording a podcast. So let's talk about all of this that I've been knitting and a whole lot more. Hi everyone, my name is Katrina Walser from Oliphant Cat, and I'm a knitting teacher, designer and tech editor based in Sydney, Australia. And welcome back to my channel. So if you are new here and you just clicked on the thumbnail for some reason, then it's nice to see you and I'm glad you've come to watch. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm very glad that you're here. If you're a new-ish viewer, it's possible that you've never seen a podcast episode over here before. So I used to run a pretty regular podcast. I'd film once a month, and for some reason I just sort of got out of the habit at the end of last year, and I kept putting it off, and the next thing I knew it had been 9 months, and I'd published a few videos that had quite a few new subscribers come from them, but I just haven't done a podcast. So I thought I'd film one just to catch you all up, and so that if I'm making more regular podcasts in the future, then the continuity is sort of there and you can see where the patterns came from and what was a whip and what was an FO and stuff. So in the last 9 months, I have knit 37 projects and about 10,000 10,000 meters of yarn. And so I've got a lot to catch up on. So what I'm actually going to do is split this video into two halves. The first half is going to be new patterns that I worked on, as well as other projects that weren't necessarily made just to stash down. So these are projects that were things I wanted to make for myself or for a gift that maybe I had to buy yarn for. I've definitely bought some yarn. And then the second half of the video, which I'll publish in a week or so, will be an update on how the actual stash down's going and a bunch of smaller projects that I did that were definitely stash down projects. So yeah, we've got a lot to talk about, so I guess I should just get going. So grab yourself a coffee, I've got one too, and go grab your knitting and I will just get you up to date with where I'm at. So first off, the thing that everyone always asks me that I forget to update you on is what I've been wearing, or like what I am wearing. So this is the Gumnut Tee. It's by Jane Bell, who is a podcaster as well and a lovely Danish designer. She used to live in Australia, but she's moved back to Denmark. This was a pattern that I tech edited for her and then also then knit because I loved it so much. And the yarn is, it's yarn that I picked up while I was in holiday in North Carolina. They just happened to be having a fiber festival there, so I went. And I don't remember any of the details, but the main yarn is a silk and cotton blend, I think, or silk and cotton and linen. And then the contrast colors are all sock yarn minis, and I'll put a link to my Ravelry project page for it down below because there should be more of the details of the yarn in there. Also on that note, I normally put all of the links to the patterns and the yarns in the description box below, but it's going to be just too much this time around. So what I'll do is I'll put the links to each of the individual Ravelry project pages, and that has the details for the pattern and the yarn for each project. And if Ravelry is not accessible to you and you would like more details, then leave me a comment and I will respond to all the comments that I can and give you the actual details so you have links to where you can find the patterns and the yarn. Okay, so the first lot of things I have to talk to you about today are the patterns that I've written in the last 9 months. So the first pattern that I wrote back in December was a pattern called the Pinstripe Top. And this was written mostly because I wanted to experiment with vertical stripes in a project. So if you've been knitting for a while, or even if you haven't, you may know that it's really tricky to do vertical stripes in knitting because of the way knitting's constructed. If you want to do vertical stripes, a lot of the time you have to do 1x1 color work. But so the way that I got around this was by constructing the top from side to side. So you actually knit it starting in the middle. You do a provisional cast on and then you knit this way out to the side and then this way out to the other side, and that lets you stripe your top vertically. So there were a lot of firsts in this design. It was my first seamed garment that I designed. So the front, the back, and the two sleeves are knit separately, and then you seam them all together, and then you do the cuff and the cuff on the sleeve in the round. It was also my first set-in sleeve design, so If you're not super familiar with all the different terminology for garment construction, I don't blame you. But in most knitted beginnerish patterns, the types of jumpers or sweaters you'll see are called either circular yokes or raglans, which is like what I'm wearing here. And that's where you cast on around the neck, and then all of the stitches sort of grow out from that initial set of cast on stitches, and you get this sort of unconstructed look, basically. Like, it's lovely, but the shoulder just sort of droops down like this. In a set-in sleeve, that's a bit closer to what you would get on a commercial t-shirt, and that's where the shoulder seam sits here. And so you have a bit more of a structured shoulder. The maths for a set-in sleeve is pretty tricky. Well, it was tricky enough that I've been scared off from doing it for a really long time. So I finally decided to do it. I sat down and did a bit of a deep dive into how set-in sleeve construction worked, and I finally figured out how to get the sleeve and the shoulder seam all lining up and the right heights and things, and so I put that all into the pattern. So this was written for Knit Picks, and it's in their yarn called Salvage, which is a 5-ply or sport weight recycled cotton. And this was also the first 5-ply garment that I've written a pattern for. It's possibly also the first 5-ply garment that I've made. I don't use a lot of 5-ply. It's not that common in Australia. And so it worked out really lovely. It's still quite a bit lighter weight than it would be if you had an 8-ply garment, but it's got a nice drape to it. As you can see, it's not actually finished. So what happened with this top is that I was a little bit silly, and I was still very much in stash down mode when I wrote this. So I started writing it in December, and I don't think I had bought any yarn for over a year at that point. And so this was some of the first yarn that was entering my stash for a really long time. And so I was trying to be quite conservative with how much I asked for. So I got 4 or 5 balls, I think, from Knit Picks initially. And then as I was making it, I realized that I had severely underestimated how much yarn I need. And whenever you design a pattern, it's already quite of a rush to get things done. And so I had to get a second round of yarn shipped to me, and that did end up blowing up my stash quite a bit because they sent me a lot of extra yarn just to make sure I wouldn't run out again. And so I was in a big rush. So I only knit as much as I needed to knit to know that the pattern would work. And so what that meant is that I made the front, the back, and the sleeve. I seamed this end all together, and then I did the cuff and the collar. And then I left this side conspicuously open because the 2 sleeves are exactly the same, and the way you sew them in is exactly the same. So once I knew one was working, I didn't need to do the other one. So I put this down probably in late December, and then I didn't pick it up again until, I don't know, maybe 6 months later. I did make the other sleeve, and so this is ready to go. I just blocked it the other day. And so I'm going to make this as soon as I can because it's suddenly very sunny and spring-like in Sydney, and I would really like to be able to wear this top. So the second pattern that I have to show you is most of the reason why I was in a rush with that pattern. So aside from the fact that I needed to send it to Knit Picks, I also had a second pattern in the works that was due pretty quickly after the pinstripe top. So these are socks called Falling for Socks. And again, this was a set of firsts. This was my first sock pattern because I am not a sock knitter, or at least that's what I would tell myself for a very, very long time. If you've been here for any amount of time, I've probably told you that as well. They just aren't something that I ever really knit. And I've realized the reason I don't knit socks often is because I never seemed to get the fit right. But about 18 months ago, I decided I really wanted a pair of socks. And because I wanted one pair of socks, I ended up making about 3 pairs of socks because I kept having to retry until I got a fit that I really liked. And once I did have that fit that I liked, I was posting about it on Instagram. And then I was contacted by Sarah from Bombed Yarns, who is a lovely designer from Tasmania. And she was doing a sock box subscription. Sorry, sock box. I find it really difficult to say. But she was doing a sock box subscription for all of 2025. And what that meant is she was commissioning a bunch of Australian and Kiwi designers to write a pattern for a pair of socks. And then she was collaborating with them to develop sock bases and colors and then put it all together into a kit. And she was sending out one of these kits every month in 2025. So you can probably still get the last couple of boxes for the rest of the year if you're interested, and I'll make sure to put a link down below to where you can see those. But I was the Much box, and so I put all of the things that I had learned from trying to be a beginner sock knitter into this pattern. And so hopefully it can help other people who are trying to also get into sock knitting to figure out how to fit their socks correctly for themselves. So the pattern's called Falling for Socks, which was meant to be a bit of a play on words. So because it was March, then it felt a bit like autumnal and like fall. So I chose very autumn sort of colors, but then also it was falling for socks as in like, it's how I fell in love with socks, was by figuring out how they fit properly for me. So this is written for regular sock weight yarn. The original yarn it was written for is a merino silk blend, but it's not available anymore via Sarah's store. She just made an exclusive for the sock box. But you can use basically any regular sock yarn that you'd like. It takes 100 gram skein as well as 3 20-ish gram minis. And the contrast colors, I'm quite proud of how they turned out. So I tried to make the toe extra long because I find that in a lot of sock patterns, I don't like how little contrast color there is in the toe section. So it's a bit longer than normal. And then the heel is a German short row heel. So I've discovered that for me, short row heels are the best fit. And I think that's one of the key insights that I've had with knitting socks, is that one of the ways you can really try and figure out what works for you best is by knitting a couple of different types of heels, because that seems to be what changes the fit the most. So I have fairly skinny feet, and so a lot of the more traditional heel flap and gusset style socks are just very baggy around my ankle, and so I found that the shorter heels work best for me. And also I made the majority of it 2x2 ribbing because ribbing's a lot more forgiving. So because it's so stretchy, if you don't get exactly the right number of stitches for your foot size, it'll still adapt to how wide or skinny your foot is a bit better than stockinette normally would. And so that's also good for beginner socks. So if you'd be interested in this pattern, it does have a lot of worksheets and things in it to explain how to fit it to your foot and how to try it on and make sure the foot length works out okay. So I'm pretty proud with how much help I've given to beginners in it. It's available on Ravelry, and I can put a link to that down below. So yes, this is Falling for Socks. Okay. The next two patterns were ones that I wrote fairly recently for the winter, and they're both collaborations that I did with Great Southern Yarn. And so they produced this beautiful yarn. It's called SRS Merino. So it's non-superwash, but it is so soft. So this is their 10-ply merino, and I knit two patterns in it. The first one is called the Lead Light Beret, and it's a cabled beret. It only takes one skein of yarn, and it comes in two sizes. So this is the smaller size because that's what fits my head better. So that's what it looks like on. Sorry if that's messing up my hair, I'm not too sure. And then I did also knit the second size, and that's a sample in Grumpy Ginger at the moment. So I wrote this pattern in 2016. It was one of the first patterns that I wrote, and I was really proud of it at the time, but it definitely needed a bit of a refresh. And I've been trying to rework some of my older patterns into Australian yarns. It's knit bottom up, so you start with a tubular cast on, which actually is much easier than I've thought. So this was one of the first projects I've done a tubular cast on for, and it turned out to be pretty straightforward actually. But I put a tutorial up for how to do it in the round on my YouTube channel, so I'll put a link to that up here. And then the cable design sort of grows out of the cables of the ribbing, and then they all meet up here in the center, and then you bind off just by closing up the top. So if you like cables, it's definitely a fun, quick project. And if you're new to cables, I don't know if it would be a great first cable project, but it's a good first adventurous cable project. because I did put both charted and written instructions into the pattern. So if you're not used to reading charts yet, you can just use the written instructions. And then the second pattern that I wrote with them is called Starry Vista. And this is definitely beginner friendly. It's 2 skeins of the same base, so the 10-ply yarn, but it was specifically written for darker yarn. So I'm quite proud of this pattern because it looks quite simple, but it has a few interesting tweaks that keep it really refined looking. So first off, it's actually knit corner to corner. So you begin in this bottom corner here and you increase out until it's as wide as it needs to be. And then you knit straight up on the bias, which means that you increase on one side and you decrease on the other side. And that's what keeps the edges straight. But having it knit on the bias means that it can be in stockinette and not curl in. So normally if you're knitting stockinette as just a long rectangle, the edges tend to curl in. But with this one, you still get a nice flat scarf, even though it's in stockinette. And then also, the bottom has this lace design in it. They're just eyelets, so it's a really, really simple lace. So if you'd like to experiment with lace, it's a good first pattern to try out. And it means that it's a bit easier to see your stitches in the dark yarn that you're working with. And once you're wearing the scarf, because the yarn's quite dark, the lace just sort of lets some light in and it gives it a bit more visual interest. So that's Starry Vista. You can buy it as well on Ravelry or on the Grumpy Ginger website, or maybe on the Great Southern Yarn website. On the Great Southern Yarn website. And if you go buy it on the website, you can get the yarn and the pattern together. So those are all the patterns that I wrote, and they definitely didn't contribute to the stash down at all, because when you write patterns and you're collaborating with yarn companies, then they tend to send you the yarn. So none of that was stash, and some of it just contributed a lot of yarn to my stash. So we're definitely in the negative so far. The next set of patterns that I wanted to show you are projects that I knit because I really wanted the project and not because I was trying to get the yarn out of my stash. And most of these were big passion projects. So I will show you what I've been doing. So first off, I have a garment for myself. This is called the Moline cardigan. I don't know how to pronounce the designer's name, but I'll put all the details up here on the screen. So I finished this maybe a month ago, possibly 6 weeks. I've been wearing it a lot since then. It's so cozy. It's really, really cozy. So this was actually the very first garment that I've ever made holding a yarn together with mohair. Or in this particular case, it's not mohair, it is Suri alpaca. So the yarn is line weight from Pearl Soho, which is a 4-ply 100% wool. And the fluff is Suri alpaca from 3 Cats Yarn. And I got it years and years ago. So this is all definitely out of stash, which is nice. It's this gorgeous duck-egg blue that she actually did custom for me because she's a friend of mine. And the yarn it was held together with is a very neutral sort of beige. Now, I've actually made a garment in the line weight yarn before, and it peels like nobody's business because it's a single ply yarn. So I was told that holding it together with a second strand of yarn would help keep it from peeling quite so much. It is still peeling a bit, about as much as you'd expect for a mohair, I guess. And I think it should be pretty easy to get these peels off if I just go at it with my yarn shaver or my gleaner. So I picked this pattern because I really liked how the shoulders looked. So I was looking for something that was very, very straightforward and just stockinette, but had some sort of interesting design in the shoulders that was also sort of minimalist, but at least there. So I ended up picking this because it has these lines here on the shoulders. And I know it's fairly subtle, but I really liked it. So this was the first time in a really, really long time that I didn't understand the construction of the garment before I started knitting it. So I had to just sort of go in blind and trust that the pattern would work, which is not something I've done for a very, very long time. But it worked out totally fine. The pattern's really well written, so I knew what I was doing as I went. And yeah, it just sort of all came together in some magic way that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So these are also what I think people call European shoulders, which is a bit more common these days, but something that's only sort of come onto the scene recently as far as I'm concerned. And so basically what you do is that you knit a trapezium for the back, and then you pick up along this edge and you knit up and over for the shoulder. And so it means that the shoulder seam ends up sitting sort of along the top of your back as opposed to right up here on your shoulders. I think I like it aesthetically. A lot of people say that it fits better for them, but for me, it just looks really cool. So I did the shoulders and that all worked out fine. But then I had to adjust the neckline because the row gauge that I was getting was quite different from the pattern. And so the V-neck adjustments that I made, they weren't entirely successful because I didn't get the rate of increase to be exactly what I wanted it to be. It's not really even, but you can't tell at the end of the day. And then the rest of the cardigan was really straightforward, but then the thing that really tripped me up was the button band. So in the pattern, she has a very simple ribbed button band, but I really wanted to do a double knit one because I think they look gorgeous. And so I had to figure out how to do one myself. So I ended up using a video tutorial, and I'll put a link to that up here on the screen. But I ended up picking up too many stitches along the edge. So to knit the button band on, you pick up stitches all the way around the front edge and up the back of the shoulders and neck, and then back down the front, and then you knit the button band onto those stitches. And I just picked up way too many stitches. So then what happened is that the button band was too long for the cardigan, and it was making the front of the cardigan warp in this really weird way. So what I ended up doing then was that I cut the button band off. I figured out how to cut it off cleanly, and thankfully there was a way of doing that. And then it was really obvious after that how much longer it was, because when you laid the button band flat against the cardigan, there was a good, I don't know, maybe 2 inches of extra button band off the bottom of the cardigan. So I definitely picked up too many stitches. I'm glad that I bothered to do that because it sits much more nicely now. The actual cardigan fits properly instead of looking weird and sort of bunched up. And then the other thing that ended up being a bit tricky was actually sewing the buttons on. So it was really fortunate and just completely coincidental that maybe a week or two before I was going to start doing the button band, I watched a podcast episode by Ali Makes Everything, and she did this giant deep dive into all the research she'd done about making really neat looking button bands and neat looking buttons. I don't want to go into everything she said because she's already said it, so I'll put a link to that up here on the screen if that's something that you're interested in seeing. But the main tip that I got from that podcast, at least in terms of the buttons, is that you want to leave a bit of space between the button and the button band. You don't want the button to be sewn on really tightly against the button band. So hopefully you can see this, but if you look at my button, it's sort of floating on top of the button band, like I can stick my fingers in under there. And so that helps it all lay a lot more flat. And so if you want to know how to do that, Ali actually goes into enough detail in her podcast episode that I understood and could copy. And so that helps the buttons all sit a lot more neatly on the cardigan. So yeah, I really love this cardigan. It's very sophisticated looking, if I do say so myself. It is a little bit bigger than I would have liked, but that's okay. I still wear it all the time anyway. Okay, the next project that I knit, I will mention briefly, but I can't talk about too much. It was a giant oversized jumper that I made as a sample for a shop, and they do secret sample knits, so I can't actually tell you what it is or where it is, but it was an interesting project in that I hadn't really realized that the size that they were asking me for was way bigger than the size that I knit for myself normally. So it looked hilarious when I put it on because it was large and oversized. But the main thing that I learned from that project was how to do a tubular bind off. So through doing some other projects that I'll talk about in the second video, I have gotten really comfortable doing grafting in the last 9 months or so, which I'm really glad for because it's a good skill to have in my toolbox. And so I figured I should try finally doing a tubular bind off because I've always been scared of sewn bind offs, but given that I'm a bit more comfortable with seaming and grafting and things these days, I'd give it a shot. So it turned out really well, and I'm glad that I know how to do that now. So I'm going to tubular bind off everything. Well, not really, but I'll definitely use it a lot more because it gives a beautiful edge. The next project I want to show you are a pair of mitts that I made for my best friend. So I went on a trip to Tasmania with my best friend. We did a bit of a girls' trip, and I thought to commemorate it, it would be cute if I bought her some yarn and knit her something. So she had this pair of fingerless mitts that she was wearing the whole trip, and she didn't really like them. So I decided to make her some new ones. So I brought a pair of knits called the Promenade mitts, on the trip with me, and they have this cable pattern that runs up the back, but then they have a flap that goes over your fingers so that they're fingerless on the inside, and then you can take the flap off or put it on depending on how cold your fingers are. And so she wanted the same thing, but without the flap. So I just adapted the pattern and made her these fingerless mitts. So the yarn is also from Sarah from Bombed Yarns. So it was really great. I managed to go visit her because her studio's in Hobart, which is where we were. And she had this rusty orange color just sort of sitting in the discount bin. And it was exactly the color that Jade had been asking me to look for when I told her I would buy her yarn. So I bought her this and I whipped up these mittens, and they were meant to be for her birthday, which was at the start of August. It's now the middle of September and I clearly still have them. So I will get them to her at some point, hopefully. But yes, those are my promenade fingerless mitts. So the next thing that I have to talk about is a top that I made for my niece. So when I mentioned earlier that I had a lot of salvage left over from the pinstripe top, it actually worked out really well because I wanted to make something for my niece for her birthday. So she is 4, well, she turned 4, and she's so sweet. A lot of the time when I'm wearing something knit, she'll ask me about it and ask me if I made it and express sort of like really interested surprise in the fact that I had made it. So I decided to make her a top for her birthday. So the pattern was called Ang by Sigrid Marie Blom. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But it was a free pattern, I'm pretty sure. And it was for this really cute top that was plain stockinette, but it has these little lace fluttery sleeves and then a fluttery lace bottom. And so I did the main part in the darker of the two blues that I had in the salvage, and then I did all of the lace sections in the light blue for a bit of contrast. And so it was a really interesting knit. The shoulders again were that European style construction, so I think that was actually the first thing that I knit that was in that construction. So it was definitely a bit of an adventure for me. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, but that was all okay. But the mind-boggling thing was the fluttery bits on the sleeves. So you do the flutter at the bottom first, and that was all fairly straightforward. And then you do the flutters on the sleeves last. And good gracious, So what it is that the way that you get it to sort of flutter is that you work short rows, but you're working short rows across multiple repeats of a lace chart. So the lace chart in the pattern is quite skinny and it's repeated several times along the length or like the width of the flutter. And so you're doing these short rows, but every time you do a short row, it means that it changes which row of the lace chart you're on for each different repeat. And so that's about the best explanation I can give you because it was sort of mind-boggling how this thing was constructed. As I was doing it, I just couldn't believe someone had written a pattern like this. And it ended up being more intuitive in the end than I thought that it would be, but it was still a little wild. So I'm glad that I did it because it came out really cute. But just be warned that if you do want to knit this pattern, the sleeves are interesting. Worth doing, but interesting. Okay, and then the next project I have to show you is one I'm very, very proud of. So this is a jumper I made for my son. And it's, oh my gosh, okay, it's so cute. He looks so cute in it, but also I'm just really proud of it in how I made it. So I made my husband a jumper maybe 18 months ago. So this is my husband's jumper. It's a pattern called Porter I'm pretty sure it's by Hudson and West. And they wrote Porter as a cardigan, but we really wanted it as a jumper. So I figured out how to adapt the pattern into being a jumper pattern. And so this is how it turned out, and he really likes it. He wears it pretty often, but I had a lot of leftovers. So the yarn was Knit Picks Wool of the Andes 10-ply. They call it worsted because they're an American company. And the main body is in the non-superwash version of the yarn. And then the cuffs and the collar are in superwash because I thought that would be a little softer and less itchy in the parts that were really touching his skin. So I had a lot left over. And after my son was born, I got a little obsessed with the idea of making him a mini version of the jumper. So there is a Porter mini pattern, and I was pretty excited because it's also a jumper, so it meant I wouldn't have to convert anything from a cardigan. And then I went to go buy it, and I realized that the way they've made the mini version is that they've just adapted it for 4-ply yarn so that it's smaller. And I really wanted to use the yarn that I had left over so that they'd be really matching, and so I had to write my own pattern. Of course I did. Okay, so what I did with this is I found the dimensions for a child's V-neck jumper, and that was from Karen, I think. It's just a very basic jumper pattern, and they give it out for free. You don't even have to give your email address to get it, but it's just stockinette, and so I just used it for dimensions. And then what I did is that I basically used Wes's jumper as a giant swatch, and I measured how wide each of the individual cable panels was. And then from that, I decided which of the cable panels I wanted to put into each jumper piece. And then I could use the measurements to figure out how many repeats of each cable I could fit and how much of this sort of seed stitch that I needed on the ends. So the bit that was really tricky was figuring out the decrease rate for the raglans, but it worked out okay. Just some of the decrease rates were really wild, especially because the raglan and the V-neck need to be decreased at the same time, and they had different rates of decrease. Keeping track of it all was a challenge, but it worked out fine. So the one thing that tripped me up a little bit is that I ran out of the non-superwash version of the yarn. So the top sort of quarter or third of these sleeves is actually in the superwash yarn, but you can't tell, and I'm not too fussed. I've washed it, and it's not like anything's grown at rapidly different rates to anything else in the jumper, so it worked out fine. I initially had a V-neck collar on this, and it didn't look great, and I really just wanted the big grandpa shawl collar, so I added that on last. So this was going to be an entry for the Easter show. Sydney has a big agricultural show every year, and I've entered in it the last couple of years, but I didn't get it done in time. So my big goal was to get it ready for Father's Day, and I did. And we took photos of them in their matching jumpers, and they're so adorable. And we're going to go on a trip to America in December, and so I'm definitely going to pack these jumpers and just make sure that Jonathan gets some wear out of it before he grows out of it next winter. So the last project I want to talk about is my Stella Quilt Blanket by Laura Penrose. This project has been going for a long time. So I started it in probably July or August last year, and I finished it around March. And it's too difficult to show you what it looks like on the screen because it's huge, but I'll put pictures up as I go. And also, this is what one block of it looks like. So there are 9 of these star-shaped blocks that make up the blanket, and then it has a border on the end. That was a non-insignificant amount of knitting. So this was my Easter show entry for the year. I came second, which was really nice. So I was in the blanket category. So each of these blocks is made up of between 12 and 16 individual colored triangles, and then the rest of the triangles in the block are neutral. And every time I wanted to start a new block, I had to sit down and take a look at all of the scraps that I had for that color, figure out how much that I had of each of those scraps, figure out how many triangles I could make from each scrap, and then decide how I was going to arrange each of the triangles to make the overall block look coherent. And one of the extra fun, not challenges, just sort of extra fun bits really, was that because I was working with a mix of either 8-ply or 4-ply held double, I could get way more colors out of the set of colors that I had because I could hold 2 4-ply strands together to make a different color. So a good example here is on this block here, both this, and this sort of set of triangles uses one of the same strand of yarn. It's this like pinky yellow color here, and it's just held together with different colors here on the sides. So planning out each quilt block was a bit of a puzzle. It was a really fun puzzle. I would end up with these sort of diagrams to lay out which colors I was using in which part of the quilt block. And even then, some of the diagrams didn't quite work, and I'd have to make it up as I went. And it was a really fun challenge. I haven't ever worked with something that was this color focused, and it was just so much fun. So I would definitely recommend the pattern. I am thinking of making a video about how to make this blanket. So the pattern comes with a full tutorial, but there are a lot of extra tips and tricks that I think I've picked up along the way that aren't to do with just the mechanics of the knitting, which is what the tutorial video sort of goes over. So for example, some of the things I've realized as I knit is that if you either hate picking up stitches or weaving in ends, you definitely shouldn't make this blanket. As much as it's fun, if you really hate those two things, you definitely shouldn't make this. But I also had a lot of extra tips about how to do the weighing of each of your scraps and how to plan out each of the squares. So if that's something you'd be interested in, if it's a blanket pattern that you've had your eye on for a while, because I know that it was quite popular maybe about a year ago, then let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to make the full video. So those are all the big projects that I wanted to show you. The other half of the knitting that I've done in the last 9 months have been pure stash busters. So they're things that I mostly chose based on the fact that I wanted to get some yarn out of my stash. And so I'll do an update on those. Hopefully that video will be out next week. And I'll also do an update then on the state of my stash, how many meters I've added, because I have finally actually added a lot of stuff to my stash, and how much I've gotten rid of and what the total is. Then we'll have a bit of a clean slate and I can just do regular updates from there. If you've made it this far through the video, then thank you very much. I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button below if you got something out of it, because it just helps other people find the video and the channel. And if you have any questions you want to ask, or if you have any clarifications or more details you want on the patterns or the yarn, then chuck a comment down below and I usually get back to them pretty quickly. And if you'd like an update for when that next video is out, you can subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, and that'll give you an update on when it's coming out. Or you can just subscribe like normal by hitting this button right here. And if you'd like to catch up with